Hi, this is Sandeep Jain. Welcome to my channel Dog Talks Online. So today's topic is beans. Yes, I'm talking about Jack and the Beanstalk. The reason this came up in my head was I was reading on Facebook. Somebody had posted this intensely, deeply medical stuff about G6PD deficiency. And I can bet you most of you who are non-medical people would never have heard of this deficiency. And it just struck me how a trip that I had recently made kind of connected to the discussion that was going on about G6PD deficiency. So I was in Italy and I went to the Vatican, and they have a room there that's called the School of Philosophy. And in this room, they have this very famous painting by Raphael. And in that painting, he took all of the important figures from Greek history and painted them on this wall. So you can see that he's painted a temple. On one side is the god of light, Apollo, and on the other side is god of wisdom, Athena. And then he has all these characters lined up, and each of those characters actually has a story. And I'll go over those stories in another video perhaps. But the one I want to really focus on is the picture of Pythagoras. And I'll just show you a video clip that I took in the Vatican, in the School of Philosophy, so you get an idea of this character that we're talking about. So what does Pythagoras have anything to do with Jack and the Beanstalk? Well, we all know Pythagoras' theorem, of course. Right angle triangle, a square plus b square is equal to c square, which the a, b, c being the sides and the hypotenuse respectively. We've all learned of that, right? But what is not very widely known is, there's a whole school of philosophy or a whole school of thought that is called the Pythagorean school of thought, where they worship numbers. And to Pythagoras and his followers, the universe was all about math and about numbers. And of course, he was persecuted and he moved on to another island and established himself all over again. So the story goes that he was pursued by his enemies. He reached a farm. There was a farm of fava beans. And rather than him and his followers cross it, he chose not to. And this is where our discussion about Jack and the Beanstalk comes in. So, the Jack and the Beanstalk, the beanstalk is actually a fava beanstalk. And fava beans are a little peculiar because the stalk does not have any partitions in it. It's almost like a hollow reed, kind of something that you can clip and smoke through it. It's like a pipe. And what Pythagoras thought was these beans come from Hades, the underworld, and the souls come through this. And cutting them or consuming them is like almost eating your parents' head, for example. So that's what the thought was behind him barring his followers from ever eating fava beans. And Plato and Aristotle have gone into this at quite length. But the real truth actually is something else. So that plausibly is the explanation, but the real truth is something else. Pythagoras really suffered from Favism. And what is Favism? Well, he was intolerant of fava beans. So in some people, when they consume fava beans, all the red blood cells break down in their body. And they have what is called hemolysis. Hemolysis is breakdown of red blood cells. And as a result of this, they really fall sick. And people can die from it. And that's the reason some folks cannot consume certain medications as well. And this is a condition that's called G6PD deficiency. It's an enzyme deficiency, a glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase enzyme deficiency. It's actually one of the commonest enzyme deficiencies known to mankind. In the US, in Illinois, there was a penitentiary where they actually studied prisoners. These prisoners were actually asked for consent and they volunteered themselves. And medically speaking, in the 1950s, gave them anti-malarial medications to see who would have this life-threatening breakdown of blood cells in their body. And that's how this condition was studied. But going back to Pythagoras, so Pythagoras actually, when he consumed fava beans, he'd get very gassy, he'd have this life-threatening experience, and growing up he figured out very fast that this was deadly. So he never even ventured near fava beans. And by the way, the reaction can happen even with dried fava beans, for example. So when he was being pursued by his enemies, he said, I'd rather die than cross this fava bean field. And guess what happened? They got him and they killed him. So he actually laid down his life rather than go through a farm full of fava beans. And two of his followers, a husband and wife, the wife was pregnant. Many of his followers were killed as well. And the husband was asked why the Pythagoreans did not want to cross that farm, because obviously if they'd cross that farm, they would be safe. And the husband wouldn't spill the beans, sort of. And then they came to the wife, and the wife, I forget her name now, but she was asked the same question. And she happened to be a Macedonian. Again, Alexander the Great was a Macedonian as well. And she took a knife and cut her tongue. And she was pregnant, by the way. She took her knife and she cut her tongue and threw the tongue at the captors and said, I would rather, and basically, said that she wouldn't be spilling the beans as well. And they ended up killing her as well. So these are interesting stories that came to my head about G6PD deficiency. And I said I should share it with you, because sometimes it makes understanding a subject very simple and it sticks. So let's talk about G6PD deficiency for a little bit, because it's a very, very interesting condition. Another very important mistake that people make is they think that a second dose would make it worse, but a second subsequent exposure would make it worse. Actually, it doesn't. The first exposure just kills all the red blood cells that had to be killed, and the second pill really does not have any worsening effect. So why is that in one dose, all the cells that could be affected are affected at once? So in a patient that has G6PD deficiency, there are two populations of red blood cells. And the newer cells are resistant to it and the older cells aren't. So when you take this medicine, like an anti-malarial medicine like Primaquine, for example, the older cells all get lysed or they burst, and the newer cells continue to live on. And that's why a subsequent dose would not cause this effect. So what symptoms do people get when they have G6PD deficiency? Well, once they consume let's say Fava Beans, or they consume anti-malarial medicines like Primaquine, 1 or 2 days, usually 1 or 2 days later, they start to pee Coca-Cola colored urine. Yep, it's like they're peeing soda. And they get fever, they get cramps and aches and pains, and they go into kidney failure as well. So it's a very serious reaction that you get. And of course, people do recover from it, because one of the things that's very peculiar to this disease is its penetrance. So first of all, it's transmitted from mother to son, so it's X-linked disease. So there's a polymorphism that's seen. So historically, even though about 500 million people in the world have this deficiency, if you look at the spread of this disease, it starts in the Mediterranean area and then goes through the Middle East. So the Arab countries have it. Then it goes all the way to India, for example, and then it crosses into some parts of Southeast Asia as well as China. It definitely started around the Mediterranean before involving some parts of Africa and the Middle East, and then moving on. And it's the same pattern that you see in the transmission of malaria. Malaria gets transmitted by a mosquito, and the two types of malaria that are really common are Plasmodium vivax and falciparum. And carrying this trait makes you resistant to the infection by malaria. And we know that in areas that have a high density of malaria, the G6PD is more prevalent. It becomes more pronounced. Peculiarly, it has even been used to identify who's really native Indian, for example. The Adivasis in India carry this at a higher frequency than the regular people. The most common population affected by this tends to be in the Middle East and around the Mediterranean. And interestingly, even beta thalassemia has a similar spread, but of course has nothing to do with malaria, even though it does offer some protection. That has to do with the Greek invasion. When Alexander conquered these territories across the erstwhile Persian Empire, he encouraged his troops to marry locally, to make governing easy in that sense. And a lot of the Greeks intermarried, and their culture, of course, permeates all the way through India, including in our dishes that we consume in India. Several of these are actually the same dishes that are consumed in Greece. So going back, there's a definite advantage of G6PD deficiency because it makes you resistant to the malarial parasite. The malarial organism cannot live inside these cells. Also, remember, just talking about red blood cells, in cell biology, studying red blood cells was a real landmark because this was one of the first cells to be studied. And G6PD deficiency, even though it is identified, back in time, they didn't have an explanation at the time of Hippocrates, to Pythagoras, all the way to the 1920s when it was first described and understood. It wasn't until the 1950s that real investigation started into this deficiency. Now you might say, if you think about it, it just makes sense. If I was to draw 10 ml of a blood sample, that would give me 50 billion red blood cells to study. And these cells are very stable, they remain in solution, they don't get deformed, you can actually study them very easily. So as they were studying them in the 1950s, as the first human cells to be studied in the 1950s, they came up with the galactose deficiency and the G6PD deficiency at the same time. They discovered them, and of course then they did studies on the prisoners, and it took science another decade or so before we discovered how we can tag these red blood cells with chromium 51 and then have them circulate, and you can basically measure the radioactivity and know the lifespan of red blood cells. So that's the evolution of biology, all linked to G6PD deficiency. All of it is linked to our discovery of red blood cells and Favism. Just talking about G6PD deficiency, so Italians have it, Greeks have it, anybody living in the Mediterranean area, sometimes it's as much as 7 to 10% of the population carries this gene, and you can screen for it as well. Importantly, in the old days, back when I used to train, for example, you could look at the peripheral smear and look for Heinz bodies, and Heinz bodies are these little black dots on red blood cells, and that was actually an impending sign of hemolysis. You must have seen those white naphthalene balls that's commonly used in India to save their woolen clothing from spiders and insects, and it's very important to remove those naphthalene balls and air the blanket or the clothing, because if your child or somebody is susceptible to if you're carrying that trait, the child or the adult that ends up inhaling naphthalene will also get an acute reaction where they will break down all the red blood cells. Also another thing to remember, when you get neonatal jaundice, when a child is born, G6PD deficiency related neonatal jaundice happens day 4 to 7, and sometimes can be up to 3 weeks after birth, and that's usually a clue as well. So apart from the Heinz body, you can also see these ghost cells in the blood. They're called hemi-ghost RBCs, and if you were to count those hemi-ghost RBCs, you could actually predict how much more hemolysis would be happening. The role of looking at a peripheral smear and answering those questions in the boards is still really important to know. G6PD deficiency, Heinz bodies, hemi-ghost cells, neonatal jaundice, and so one of the things that you need to remember is in the US, for example, we see it predominantly as a disease that's transmitted amongst the black population. We see it in people with Mediterranean ethnicity. The fava beans actually were important even in the Middle Ages. There was this huge famine or drought in the Middle Ages. The island of Sicily, people prayed to the gods for there to be food, and the only food that was left around was these fava beans. So they're very refractory to weather changes, drought and famine. That's a good way to remember that it's a very hardy bean, and that's why it's used so widely. Not just in the Mediterranean, it was used even before that in the Nile civilization. So, for example, Ramesses, one of the pharaohs of Egypt, offered like 12,000 jars of fava beans, and the Egyptians actually worshipped the beans in such a way that even the priests were not allowed to look at it or consume it, and the common man absolutely could not consume fava beans. They were considered that sacred. So these beans have interesting history. In Sicily, for example, today they celebrate Saint Joseph's Day. That's nothing but a celebration around the Middle Ages survival period, thanks to the fava beans, because they were all that they could consume. In fact, if you meet an Italian person and he's carrying a dried fava bean in his wallet, or in an Italian kitchen, if you find dried fava beans, those are all the superstitions that are linked to this event in the Middle Ages. Sicilians could survive only because of their consumption of fava beans. So Favism, Jack-and-the-beanstalk, Pythagoras, and this beautiful painting of Pythagoras in the school of Athens in Italy is all linked. This is part of the same story, and the next time you read about G6PD deficiency, hopefully you can add to this knowledge very easily. and you'll remember these facts also without having to read them again. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this video. Tune in to listen to more videos as they come along, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and like us, and please feel free to share it with your friends and family. My goal is really to simplify things, and any explanations that I have about the world around me, to share it with you and hear your thoughts as well. So please feel free to comment on this as well, and see you next time. Thank you.